And that is the bottom line to do with availability. Now, this was, if you will, not an attack, it was a software problem. And, well, actually, when you're vice president of something, unlike Captain Kirk, you can't beam yourself down to do anything about it. What you're faced with is, you're faced with the question of, is your team up to it? Well, I'm glad to say that they were. So without any help from me, they were able to find and fix whatever the problem was. And so we've had a number of issues, I think, which are coming back to the lack of availability. And that's been, if you will, the forgotten part of security. I mean, not to mention, for example, the recent British Airways disaster, which I know nothing about any more than anybody else. But what I can say is that when that kind of thing happens, that tests your backup plan, your data recovery plan. And in about, it must have been 15 years ago, in Manchester, I woke up one morning and there was no internet. And I put on the radio and it turned out there were no phones either. Because what had happened was that a disaffected employee had managed to basically destroy the BT telephone network in the north of England. And underneath Manchester there is a nuclear bunker where all the important people could go if there was a direct nuclear strike. And obviously, that didn't include me and my wife and my family, but no doubt the mayor and the functionaries would survive the problem. And so down in the bowels of this, there was a corridor, and this was going to be guaranteed proof against an H-bomb strike. So British Telecom, who always sort of believes in diversity, had two cables, one of which ran down one side of the corridor and the other of which ran down the other side of the corridor. And the disaffected employee had recognised this and found a way of pouring petrol down and setting it alight. Now, in this enclosed space, they couldn't get in to fix it for something like 2 or 3 days. And I mean, it was a disaster because the ambulances didn't work, there was no 999, so the lack of internet was kind of just a superficial irritation. But the companies divided themselves into two categories, one of which, the hero of the hour, was the Co-op Insurance Company that had a big call centre in Manchester. And they had a tested disaster recovery plan. And the people unknowingly rocked into work in the usual way, and they found, instead of their usual seats, they found coaches waiting for them. And they were bused to a hot standby system which worked on another telephone network. So, are we ready?
Well, the Panapto side is down. We rely on the camera.
So we can start. Okay, right. So, having warmed you up there, I hope we'll now get round to the real subject.
That was the funny bit, was it, Mike?
that was the funny bit, yeah. This is the serious bit. So, threat intelligence is an interesting question, and I was privileged to be able to moderate a workshop in Brussels last September, which was run by OASIS, because what has happened is that OASIS, at the encouragement of the US government, has produced a set of standards for sharing of threat intelligence. So the purpose of this talk is to kind of tell you guys what this does, what threat intelligence is, and how it relates to us being able to deal with the problems and the difficulties of fighting the cyber criminals. So basically, the challenge with that is that however much you like to say it, the average time for people being able to discover that they've been breached is very long. And not only that, but we've had a couple of recent incidents, and in particular the one that I was talking about earlier with the WannaCry in the NHS, where it would seem that the sort of traditional way that we would hope to defend against these things just isn't working. And so, because it's difficult to find examples that are written down and are publicised, I've actually used the alleged hack of the Democratic Party in the US, i.e. Clinton's emails, that was perpetrated supposedly during the US presidential election. And the reason why I've used that is that it's actually fairly well documented, and there is a documentation on the CERT, US CERT site, which was basically written by the FBI. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just kind of remember what that diagram looks like and some of the colours, because we're going to go into, using threat intelligence, an explanation of how it was done, and you will find that this is a fairly common explanation. So the problem that we have is that the cyber criminal community is highly organised, not in a hierarchical way, but in a commercial way. And there are groups of people who have, if you will, decided to go with the dark side, and they do what they do for pecuniary gain. They do it for money, and if they are good at it, then they make money, and if they aren't good at it, then they just kind of die away and fade away. So it is the ultimate capitalist society. So you have this sequence of people who will discover exploits, and they will sell these exploits, and they can often get more for them by selling them to the criminals than in fact selling them to Google and so forth. So they're finding the vulnerabilities that are otherwise undocumented. Those are turned by other professionals into malware that will exploit that. And a zero-day malware is something that's quite valuable. And those are then sold on to people who might be doing spear phishing, or eventually they will work their way through to a kind of much more industrialized stuff where they turn up in these emails that are just blasted out through spam. And all of this works effectively to keep the community going. So the idea is that if you can disrupt this model by working together against it, rather than, if you will, sort of individually licking your wounds and hoping that you'll be able to carry on, we might be able to make it more difficult for the criminals that are involved in it. So the idea is to find a way to work together against these organised adversaries. And as an analyst, what I get is I get a constant stream of product vendors who come to me saying, we've got the latest product gizmo that's going to collect all this information and it's going to somehow or other give you an answer. And what most of this has done is it was driven by the requirements of auditors who said, if you're collecting the information in a systematic way, then that is good. So you have ways of collecting it and storing it, but it's much more difficult to actually turn that data that you've got into something that's actionable, that you can do it. And so actionable intelligence is, if you will, the dream of the security vendors, to be able to make a piece of software that just will say, I see this problem and it's going to sort it out. Now, interestingly, if you follow IBM's Watson is working on that, and that's quite promising, but it isn't really quite there yet. So, what is the problem? Well, so the idea behind this isn't new, and those of you that have been in the industry will recognise many of these words or many of these acronyms, and the ones I've coloured are the ones which have come out as being the adopted standard by OASIS, and are the ones that I'm going to sort of talk about in this particular talk. So often people aren't sure of what it really means, and it's only, if you will, through understanding what these people are doing that we will be able to predict and to defend ourselves against the attacks. So it's always interesting to look that there's nothing new under the sun. And those of you that did Greek things at school, you will remember that in roughly the 5th century BC, the 4th century BC, there were continuing wars between the Persians and the Greeks. And there was a Greek called Demaratus who had been blackballed, he'd been ostracised by the city for dubious behaviour, who was in fact in Persia, and he was sort of the mayor, the leader of a Persian city. And the Persian king Xerxes asked him for his opinion about the state of readiness of the Greek defences, to which he replied something along the lines of, well, they've no money, but on the other hand, they will all fight to the last man. And it seemed pretty much still true as far as Greece is concerned today. Now, so he even though he had been drummed out of the brownies, so to speak, he still felt a duty to try and pass a message to the Greeks. And so he devised a way which is now known as steganography. He hid a message on a wax tablet by writing it on the wood underneath the wax and sent it. And so all the people that sort of passed the wax tablet on just thought, oh, this is a blank wax tablet. Now, in the story, the Queen of Sparta had a dream, and that led them to look behind the wax. Now, forewarned is forearmed. So because they knew that there was an attack coming, they were able to prepare themselves. And they didn't have any money, so effectively what they did at the Battle of Thermopylae, the naval battle that followed, they used their little boats to lure the big boats from the Persians into the shallow waters where they all foundered and lost their advantage, so they won the battle. Now, so this was based on intelligence, and there are stories like that that go throughout history. And what we need to do with regard to the cyber criminals is use the advantage of intelligence to be able to try and defeat them. Now, there are different kinds of intelligence, and people get confused about these. But in a sense, they're both intelligence. The first is the strategic intelligence, which is knowing who are the people that are your enemies, who are the adversaries, what are the things they're trying to achieve, what are their objectives, and what are the campaigns that they're doing to achieve it. And that actually is one direction which allows you to kind of understand what it is that is really going on a longer term basis. Now, most organisations have no hope whatsoever of individually figuring this out. You know, if you can only do this if you are going to join together. So if you're banks, you want to find the people that are going to exploit your banking systems. If you're retail, there'll be different people and different objectives. and countries are one, companies that have intellectual property are another example of different examples of objectives and different kinds of adversaries. There is also what I call tactical intelligence, which is basically about the tools, the tactics, the individual attacks that are going on. And most of what is talked about is really well downstream of this kind of thing. So that's basically the different kinds of intelligence. And to give you an example of what you might describe as intelligence, and again this is from a US published information, and that's a really interesting thing if you follow that through, because this is an alleged hack by the Chinese People's Republic of China Army that over a period of several years was systematically trying to steal intellectual property from US companies. And part of the intelligence that they gathered was shown, and interestingly, this is an indictment. So this is not some kind of technical document. This is taken from a document lodged with the courts in, I think it's Massachusetts or somewhere, which is basically the basis for a legal action. And one of the things that they lodged is this, and it's a bit difficult to see what it is, but basically this is time during the day, and there is days of the week are the different colours, and this is basically a set of activity which represents, shall we say, some kind of cyber threat. Now, the interesting thing you can see from this is that the people in the People's Republic of China's army who are engaged in cyber espionage against the United States work 9 to 5, Shanghai time, with a break in lunch, for lunch. And you can see it quite clearly. This is them coming into work, they go to lunch, they work through the afternoon, and they go home. And that is Shanghai time. So, you can say, well, if I know that that is my adversary, then I know when to be looking out for things that are going on. Now, for those of you that understand what I'm talking about here, what these were is that they represent changes of the IP address for a series of 4 internet domains. And what these guys were doing was they were sending targeted emails to companies which contained in them URLs which looked like, were not exactly the same as, URLs that the people in that company would normally use for one or another kind of activity. For example, for booking an airline, for booking a conference place, for booking a hotel. And for most of the time, these URLs would just take you to the benign result that you expected. But when they mounted an attack, because they were the owners of these domains, they would switch that domain for a short period of time to point to a poisoned website, which, although you would not detect it, would in fact do something like infect your computer. So knowing that as a method of attack takes you a long way towards being able to deal with it. Now, what happened as a result of that and other things is that Lockheed Martin came up with this thing that they call the cyber kill chain. And the cyber kill chain is based on threat intelligence, which consists of a set of indicators. Now, indicators are, if you will, measures that you can observe or you can compute, which tell you something is going on or something is not right. And we're all used to indicators because if we're in auditing and this kind of thing, then we're looking for those things every time we do an audit. And we're looking to see whether there are controls in place that will deal with those indicators. Now, in fact, for them to be useful, these things need to be quite reasonably. They need to be timely, they need to be relevant, they need to be specific, and they need to be accurate. So you have to, if you're going to actually be able to act upon it, be able to see what it means, to be convinced that it's correct, and to be able to do something when you've found out what it is. Now, what I think most people have come across, and most of the security practice, if you will, up to now, has been based around indicators of exposure. Those are what we would generally call vulnerabilities. And there are databases like the CE Vulnerabilities and Exposure database. Now, again, it's interesting that one of the things that the WannaCry, the NHS ransomware attack, one of the things that was not really sort of looked at in the BBC Two documentary last night was the extent to which that attack could have been prevented if the vulnerabilities had been properly dealt with. And it seemed that the NHS divided itself into two, in that some of them had agreements with Microsoft, or they had processes in place which meant that they were actually applying patches. And anyone who'd applied patches wouldn't really have noticed the attack. If, however, you had patched it because either you didn't have a process in place or you didn't have a contract that gave you the patches, then you were basically open to it. So indicators of exposure are still important, but this is not specifically what we're going to focus on here. There is another kind of indicator, which is a thing that's become called the indicators of compromise. And these are, for example, the fact that you can detect a particular pattern of activity, that you can detect a particular file, or that you can detect something coming from a particular IP address that indicates that this is malicious. And that's not quite the same thing as an indicator of exposure. So, going back to this thing that was invented by Lockheed Martin, the so-called cyber kill chain. And it's interesting because these things come from military perspectives. And yesterday, again going back to the BBC Two documentary, they were talking about using an analogy of viruses and the immune system, and there are some vendors who are now moving towards describing the approach to dealing with things in that kind of a way. But in the human immune system, you do have this indicators of exposure, which is that the various antibody mechanisms detect that there are proteins that they didn't expect to be there and start to deal with it. So this process goes through saying we have these 7 stages which start off with reconnaissance and so forth. And I will explain them in more detail in a moment. So when we look at how you might build this threat intelligence, you then have to look at the different models that there are. And in fact, there's a lot of thought has gone into these different things, and one of the models is this model called the diamond model, because people who've been faced with this have had to find ways to set words and terminology so that they can describe what is happening in a way which is unambiguously understood by different people. So in most of the models there is the notion of an adversary and a victim. And the adversary is going to use capabilities which will depend upon having some kind of infrastructure in there to attack the victim. And this can be seen through events. So we've kind of all agreed that there is the notion of events that happen, there is an email that comes, there is traffic going to your URL, there is a file with a particular signature. And that was created only in July 2013. Now the one that I'm going to talk about is I'm going to look at Grizzly Step and just describe this through the context of the kill chain. And interestingly, you will be able to get the slides afterwards. So what we have here is the adversary space, which represents the adversary in the previous thing. This neutral space, which is in black, which represents the infrastructure and capabilities, and the victim space. And the attack invariably starts with reconnaissance. Now, some of that reconnaissance could well be the reconnaissance about the people and about what is valuable. And if you've listened to Peter Woods, who gave a talk at various times, he talks about when he does his red team attack, which he is a paid hacker, if you will, he always starts off by researching the company. Who are the people? What is the company got that's valuable? Where are their facilities? And so by doing that, you end up with identifying a group of people that are likely to be your entry point into the system. And so that reconnaissance it may be, if you will, cyber reconnaissance, but it can also be people reconnaissance. So the WannaCry was basically going around and saying, if I can see a computer which matches these characteristics with a certain port open and so forth, then I'm going to attack it. In many cases, many of the attacks start off by the people discovering who is the security team, what is the shift pattern of the security team, when are they most likely to be at the pub, so to speak, who are the people in the organisation and what are their interests. Because if I want to target an attack, then I will send an email which they are just going to have to open because it's going to be something that I know they will want to open. So when you have decided upon that, you then decide upon the weapon you're going to use. And the weaponization is saying, okay, so Mike Small is interested in fishing, i.e. fishing in streams, so I'm going to send him something about salmon fishing in Loch Dhu or wherever. And when he sees that, he will want to open the email. And so basically my weapon is going to be an email which contains a link, which is going to take him to a piece of malware. And because I like to get more money out of my investment as a cyber criminal, it's probably a piece of malware which already exists and which I'm just going to reuse. Now, having created the weapon, I then have to deliver it, and that's going to be an email. And the email itself is benign until it is exploited. So until the person opens the email and clicks upon the link, there isn't anything that's happened. And clicking on that link is going to create something which is going to be installed. And in many cases that then leads to what is called command and control. Ideally, what you do at this point is you have introduced some software which will effectively open a door to the outsider. It will set up a beacon saying, I'm here, and the outsider will then come in and will then use one of the many tools that are available to try and uplift their privileges and to try and search through the environment. So, for example, if you can find out where the Active Directory is, then you can try and give yourself administrative privileges to the Active Directory, which then allows you to create a user, which then allows you to work within the environment as though you were just a benign thing, and gives you the ability to do what is your actions on objectives, i.e. you're going to steal the stuff. Now, in the WannaCry, a lot of this was in fact automated, because basically once the weapon had gone out, the system was doing its own reconnaissance. It was just scanning the internet to find any systems that had this particular characteristic, and where it did, it just simply downloaded the worm, and Bob's your uncle, off it went and destroyed things. So that's an important model, because once you've got that model, you realise that each of those stages has different characteristics. Each of those stages requires a different set of actions and controls to deal with them, and if you can deal with the problems further down towards the left, then you can prevent the thing from spreading further along. And so understanding this and understanding the symptoms you might get at the different stages gives you greater lever over how you can manage the whole thing. So what this led to is finally an agreement which is called STIX, Structured Threat Indication Information Expressions. And this is a standard way of describing the different kinds of components that we've got in here. And so in STIX you have, and this is a data model, not a flow model. You have things like an indicator, which could come from something that you can observe, and that indicator may be related to some kind of tools and techniques that are used by individuals, threat actors. So our friend STIX APT28, the threat actors will have campaigns that they run, and campaigns will, through things, be involved in targets, and ultimately you can see down here there are things which are courses of action you can take. Now, so the point is that different intelligence and analysts will probably be focused on different areas of these things. So for most organizations, building a list of threat actors is not necessarily the most important thing in their world. Being able as a bank to say, I know there is a campaign running against banks, is a big step forward. For the individual organization, what you want to be able to do is to be able to find and detect the things that you can observe, so that if you observe them, you kind of know what you need to be doing in order to protect against them. So when you're building it, most of this intelligence is built through an analysis of multiple breaches, and they might all have some kind of common characteristic, and that characteristic may be that they're targeting bank employees, and you can say, well, that means that you can deduce they might be part of campaigns using specific tools by a known group. And this gives you a way of describing a threat which can be shared, and you can also, through all that kind of thing, you've got a whole series of nuances that you can evolve from that, so that people can take those different kinds of information and use them to better defend themselves. Now, equally, there may be people who want to say, well, I'm going to use this to find the individuals and bring them to justice or whatever. These are the different uses that you might want to put on it. And the key thing at the end of all this is it identifies an action that you can take. And that turns this sort of rather haphazard view of that, you know, if I just happen to be surfing and I see something that takes my interest, I'll go and sit on my computer for a few hours and I'll save the world. The idea is to move it away from that so that it makes it much more difficult for the people who are doing these things to keep using the same tools and keep using the same techniques and to disrupt the economies of scale that they are currently exploiting. So when we look upon this from a point of view of action, you know, this is taking the same stuff from the perspective of you, the recipient. You can say, now I know that this kind of stuff is about, I can say, well, if I find emails with a particular subject line that are targeted on bank, then that is a known threat. And I can then start to say, well, I now can see that known threat and I know the tools that they may be using. So I'm going to start looking more closely for those tools at the different points in the kill chain that I described. And when I understand or see it, it gives me a straightforward view of what I need to do, what actions I need to take. So what can you do? Well, there are all of these different things, and this is a different perspective. You know, we've seen prevent and detect and remediate. So what the cyber intelligence community, the Lockheed Martin paper talks about is these 6 Ds. Now, it's interesting because this is kind of again a military thing, but we're already doing some of these things. So you can deny things by simply removing the vulnerability. You can, and it's better to be able to remove the vulnerability. You can do things to deceive, and this is the so-called sandbox. If you can detect that something might be suspicious, put it into a sandbox to see if it explodes, then you get more information on it. You can disrupt things by making it more difficult for them to understand who they're dealing with. And interestingly, I talked to a South African bank, and they had made a big improvement in their cyber security by simply changing the names of all the personal computers that they had, because previously they actually named the personal computers that were being used around the building in a way which was systematically told you which department they were in, what function they were performing. And then you changed all the names of the users so that they had no relationship to what it was that the user's job functions were, actually made a tremendous difference. So being able to make it more difficult for people, for the bad guys to figure out what's going on is important. And so now how do we share it? Well, this is the problem. The problem has been that much of the sharing that has been done up to now has been done through, first of all, circles of trust. And so I talked to a lady who is an Estonian background, is a US citizen, and she was in Estonia when there was the attack on Estonia. And so there was not the level of trust that you would expect between the Estonian government CERT and the US government CERT. And the fact that she was there happen to have a big positive influence. So we still have groups of people who trust each other because they know them, as opposed to because there is a proper way of establishing trust. Another major issue is to do with legal things, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. And then there is the technical stuff. And the STIX and TAXII helps with the technical stuff, but it doesn't necessarily help with the other things. We still need to deal with that. So if you look at the communities of trust, there are many, many of them. And well, so again, going back to my story of when I was Vice President of Development in this US company, we acquired this antivirus vendor, and there's a whole series of interesting stories about that. But one of the things that I discovered through that is that there is this community of trust, or there was then, between the antivirus vendors, that they would not only share the information that they had in a kind of an undocumented, informal way, and this was based on people who knew each other because they knew that, you know, Joe was always working in this and he was a good guy. So all of these different things, all of these different groups have their own trust relationships. And so, for example, law enforcement tends to live in a world which is law enforcement, and it doesn't, generally speaking, want to reach out. Vendors have collected information, and you will find that many of the vendors of the so-called security intelligence tools will give you security intelligence feeds at a price because it's intellectual property and they don't want you to get it for free. That there are, I'm not sure that NIST is really a circle of trust, but certainly you've seen that the computer emergency response team, the CERS, have kind of grown in prominence, and there is a UK cert which was much announced in its setting up a few months ago. And if you didn't know, then if you have an organisation which has assets inside the UK, then they will go, you can go through a process where they will share information with you. But again, their objective is to protect the UK's national critical infrastructure. And that is their primary objective. Now, if they discover in doing that that there is some other kind of thing that's going on that's attacking sweet shops, then if you have a sweet shop in the UK and you've registered with it, then they might be prepared to share that information with you. So you need to look at that. In terms of the legal challenges to sharing, one of the first things is privacy, because we've got these increasingly draconian privacy laws, which mean that if you are sharing indicators of compromise, it may be difficult to do that without potentially breaching somebody's privacy. And so, in fact, the guy from the US Department of Homeland Security was actually having a conversation with me in May about whether the GDPR law had an exception in it which would allow him to protect an organisation, whether that would, sharing information to protect against cybercrime would in fact trump the GDPR law. Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you, but that's the kind of concerns that people have. So what ends up is that the big companies end up by getting the lawyers to negotiate sharing agreements, which include things like, well, what if I gave you information that was wrong? What if I told you that this was going to be a threat and it wasn't? Or what if I failed to spot that there was a threat and I gave you something? Who's liable? And finally, there is the question about who owns it. you know, I want to make money out of this information, and so how are we going to deal with that particular kind of thing? And there is a company that's set up, which is basically they have a tool that will help you with this kind of stuff. And basically, you can, if you will, cherry pick different sources of different kinds of information, and they will give you a bundle deal based on this, based on, if you will, wholesale deals they have with different vendors of threat intelligence. Now, having got this, you might say, well, this is all very well, but if we've got this intelligence, we want to share it amongst ourselves, we want to share it between people we trust, but how can we do that? And so, in a sense, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, because the first thing is that the first group has a solution, which is called the Traffic Light Protocol, TLP. And so you may see things which come to you which say TLP green or TLP white. So there is a traffic light protocol which basically says recipients may not share, recipients may only share, recipients may share with blah blah, and it's just public. Now, it's like a classification. It is not a control mechanism. So it's better than nothing, but it simply says that if you have information that you classified that way, it's down to your discretion if you receive it as to whether or not you observe the traffic light protocol. So it's not an access control mechanism. So we have this standard for sharing information that we don't yet have, if you will, an enforcement through some kind of strong technology. And so the first group are now working on, if you will, a way of automating that, where they're creating this thing called the policy exchange, information exchange policy framework, which ultimately will lead to that. So what we have from the standard is this thing called Trusted Automated Exchange of Information, TAXII. And in fact, actually, there is a lot of security built into this, but it isn't traffic light protocol security. It basically says the notion is that you have a server which contains information which is structured using the STIX and CybOX standards, and you can connect to that in various kinds of ways. So in order to connect to it, you have to have an authentication, and sure enough, it is going to demand a multi-factor authentication, and everything that is held therein is going to be encrypted, and all of the connection is going to be encrypted. But so let's say that you are a threat analyst and you have discovered some indicators of compromise, then you can publish that information and it goes into the server. Now that if you are if you will, a client, a user of that, you can get at that information by doing query response, or you can get at it through some kind of subscription, so that it will send you notifications of new things. So there now is an agreed standard for how you can structure and describe the various indicators of compromise, and there is a structure for how you can publish it, which is a big step forward. And that is neutral. Now, so it's interesting to me that when I talk about this event that I moderated a workshop on this last September, but one of the people, or one of the groups that turns up, is the financial services ISAC. So the financial services has got smart to this, because the financial services found themselves under sustained attack from various ways, and I mean there's an example of this. It's a Belgian bank hit by fraud. There was the story about the Bangladeshi bank that was hit by fraud. So there are serious campaigns that have been run against this, which made it sufficiently worthwhile for the financial services industry to set up their own, if you will, cybercrime sharing group called FSI-SAC, which gathers information together for financial services institutions and passes information out to them, and it is a subscription model that you're a financial services organisation and you subscribe to this by paying some money. And they even went as far as paying for a product to be developed which would enable them to disseminate that, and that product is called Soltra, and it was finally sold off. So there is a product which uses STIX and TAXII, which was developed by a financial services ISAC, which is now on the streets and available. And another example of what they were trying to do. And finally, this is what happened, and this is where the Department of Homeland Security came in to all of this, because they wanted to be able to share information. In fact, they were required by the US government to be able to share this information. And it was actually the Department of Homeland Security, a man called Richard Struess, who in fact promoted this through OASIS in the first place. And there is now a free service which is available worldwide where you can get these indicators of compromise from this DHS system, the information, I thought it said it somewhere on there, the information, they have an information feed which you can subscribe to. So that basically is what we've seen from this. So the story behind the cyber threat is actually much more complicated than just some spotty kid in an attic who's trying to prove he knows more about computers than Microsoft. And basically we are facing what is effectively organised crime, not organised in the standard way with the Mr. Big, but organised through the exploitation of highly sophisticated and efficient commercial interchanges, which if we are going to be able to succeed against it, we have to be able to do more than just pick the things off piecemeal. We have to do things which make and disrupt the basic economy of scale that is being used by the cyber criminals, the cyber adversaries. And in order to do that, what we're going to have to do is to cooperate more strongly. And to do that, we need to deal with all of the barriers to sharing information, some of which are technical, some of which are cultural, and some of which are legal. And the best thing you can do if you are going to leave here and your company is not a member of CERT, of the UK CERT, and it is a UK company with assets in the UK, then make sure that it joins and at least is able to get the latest feeds from those places. So that's my presentation. I'm still here and ready to take any questions if you have any. Yes, a question from the front.
I was one of the few people working on a British standard, cyber risk and resilience for the board and executive management.
Right.
And one of the things I did was broaden the concept of cyber threat to cyber event, and I'll link that to cyber landscape. So for example, if you want to transfer like BT, and I'm saying that was an issue, your IT to India to save money, then you will need to think about not just cyber threat, but non-malicious incidents. such as not enough practice testing, examination of the backup system. So I know that your focus was on cyber threat, but what's your opinion on that?
Well, so to summarise what you're saying, the threats that are faced are wider than simply the cyber adversary. And I cannot disagree with that. I agree wholeheartedly. In fact, I was only writing something about GDPR yesterday, and what is happening with GDPR, a lot of people have become fixated with data breach. Now, in fact, that's only one small part of it. And if you then take data breach, cyber activity, cyber threat activity is only one of the potential causes for that. Mistake and misuse are equally big issues to organisations. So I wholeheartedly agree, and I agree with you that in fact this was not what I was trying to talk about.
Yes.
I was simply trying to talk about this one new thing here, which was the focus of the presentation. Yes.
Mike, you started off by discussing the ransomware attack on the NHS. Now, the thing about that attack, it was not a zero-day threat. It had been around for about 3 years, and that would actually fall in with your model of sharing information about threat intelligence. However, on a zero-day attack, there is no intelligence available. And that's one of the big challenges we face. The malware writers are always going to be ahead of the malware defenders. As Karl Popper once said, we don't know what we don't know until we know it. And the whole thing about threat intelligence is trying to second guess what might happen in the future without having any evidence to put to the main board which would support that particular thesis. So I fully agree. If there's information out there, we should share it. But unfortunately, in many cases, the information isn't out there because it hasn't happened yet.
Well, so I think there are 2 points that I would sort of respond to in what you just said there. And the first thing is that and this was brought out in the programme yesterday, which is that the good guys, supposedly, the GCHQ and Tempora and the cyber people in the US who are trying to defeat terrorism have been creating their own little tools which were intended for use as good guys. But unfortunately, you can't keep the genie in the bottle. So the problem has been where the good guys supposedly created this stuff and they didn't look after it well enough, or that it leaks. And I mean, if you take Stuxnet, for example, Stuxnet is an example of this, which was created supposedly by governments for intergovernmental attack. It was once it was out, it's in the wild. And when it's in the wild, then it's a threat to everybody. So there is this problem to do with the creation of the stuff. The second thing is that actually, because the bad guys want to make money, the actual use of 0 day is very, very limited. It's very expensive, very profitable if you have it, but the majority of the time these attacks are using stuff that is well known, and that is certainly the case. So I'm not denying that there are 0 day ones, but the problem is that there are so many of these things that are re-emerging that people know about and they haven't taken adequate precautions about, and that again, to go back to our ransomware thing, this was eventually the US government fessed up and they said, yeah, we've lost this stuff. And as soon as they fessed up, Microsoft reacted and put a patch on. But that patch was not universally applied. And there's all kinds of sort of sub-problems around this. One is that the extent to which there are industrial systems and retail systems which are based on XP, which are not patchable, or where XP was out of date and people haven't paid for patching. So the evidence is that the majority of the problem is recycling of old stuff which they do to save money. And as regards the 0 day, I have to agree with you that if it is really and absolutely totally new, it's going to be very difficult to see. And what you're trying to do, though, is to say, if I have a 0 day, then you're not going to stop the first guy that gets hit with it. But the better the intelligence gathering process you have, you want to be able to, shall we say, contain it in less time rather than more time. And that can't be too difficult, since 200 days still seems to be the norm. And that's not for 0 days. So, there we are.
May I have a second bite on this, Mike?
Yes, yes, yes.
Don't get too fixated with people wanting to make money out of this. There are many ideological reasons why they may do an attack, where money is immaterial to the whole thing.
Yes.
And that's the big danger of the 0 day attack. Everything we talk about at the moment, the 200-day exposure, worked on the basis that someone somewhere along the line is trying to make something out of this. And I think it's a huge danger for our critical national infrastructure. We cannot think on the basis that people do this to try and make money, therefore there's going to be this lead time as they build up to it.
Yes.
I think we have a major problem in the UK and possibly the rest of the world on actually accepting the fact that a 0 day attack may not be aimed at in any way for commercial reasons. It may be aimed severely to disable us.
Well, I think that it doesn't even have to be a 0 day attack for that. Because if you look at the despicable level of security that is being put in the Internet of Things, which I've talked about before, then this is a disaster waiting to happen. And I am still, barring my door to smart meters.
Sure. Me too.
Right, so there's a... The back was the first.
Thank you very much for this presentation, very interesting. Jacob Boyden from the Montfort University. About the GDPR and processing data for this, the answer to your American friend would have been yes, there is an exception for that. So I've talked to students about it fairly recently, and there's an exemption which says processing of personal data for network information security is a legitimate interest.
Oh, right.
So absolutely, and you can even do some level of profiling on that basis. So legitimate, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a computer scientist, but legitimate interest means that you can do it as long as you can argue sensibly that whatever you do outweighs any sort of privacy impact, which is likely to be the case if you're defending national infrastructure or your security system. So
thank you very much. Thank you.
Right.
So you.
Hi, Mike. Yes. Well, first of all, that was a fantastic presentation, I must say.
Thank you.
I've certainly learned a lot. Just a few things I'd like to share with the group, just based on my 10 years of experience working in information security. Now, fantastic benefits here. What I've seen in my experience in various sectors, along with the NHS, over 10 years I've met with so many of these organizations. And there is something that's sometimes quite missing from these organizations. Something very fundamental that I don't see. Things like having an information security strategy, something that's documented within the business that says, these are the things we're committing to, seeing information security rise up, that it's actually thought of at the board level, doesn't seem to be there, and I still struggle to see it from sector to sector and client to client that I work with. You talk about the reconnaissance, etc. I tend to see some people will undertake, for example, a security assessment, But when you look at the back end of it, the remediation strategy and the plan, there's nothing there. It's almost like when the IT team gets around to it, then we'll install the patch, you know. So that regimental framework and taking it somewhat serious that, look, we've got to protect the business, we've got to protect our assets, and coming up with a strong, documented security framework within the business seems to be missing from area to area that I've seen in my experience. The other bit that I've seen as well is there's a lot of decentralized teams working within organizations. For a perfect example at the moment with the GDPR, in my experience I've seen that there are teams that are sat there and they're taking on board all of this, but yet the head of IT security hasn't been involved. You know, and it seems as though they're working in pockets and trying to achieve something, but yet there's no centralized coming together to work together. And I think from what I've seen with the NHS, yes, in my experience, I've seen lots of decision makers say to me, oh, no, you know, we've got the IG toolkit, and whoever looks after that will take care of security. And they've sort of left the security assessments for someone else to look at on infrastructure. And it's, you know, that sort of commitment to the security cause seems to be a bit weak from sector to sector, client to client that I've seen. You know. So, you know, just sharing that with everyone really.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's very helpful to give people your experience. Thank you. Yes.
Picking up on one thing that you mentioned about the outmoded systems, I work in local government in London, and happened to be at an NHS information security event a few days after the I think it was quite interesting discussing with the NHS people. They're saying, yeah, well, we've got the £5 million MRI scanner, but it's running Windows XP embedded. Try patching that. Your only defence with that sort of thing is to follow the NCSC guidelines. Keep yourself up to date. If you can't keep it up to date, put an extra wall around it. But as the gentleman here, sorry, I don't know his name, quite rightly points out, I'm sure all of us, my nightmare is someone who's found a 0 day, has got a really strong reason for keeping it nice and quiet, getting it out there, and then hitting something with it. Because I think that will be a really bad day.
That's what the NSA tried to do, right? That's what the NSA tried to do until it got stolen.
Yeah, but if it was saying...
Exactly the same with available exploit. It doesn't have to be 0 day exploit, as long as you will not write a malware which is highly visible.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, this WannaCry. That was the only thing they used well available exploit, vulnerabilities, but they wrote a malware which obviously made huge mess. If it will be something so quiet as sending you particular single packets, sending local information on your infrastructure, no one would ever detect it.
But more to the point, how can that's not happen?
Well, but that's another thing. It will take a minute to create a new type of malware. It is incredibly easy to create a malware which will encrypt itself. It's very easy to create a malware which will even self-decode. So there's no way that antivirus will detect it. And the only other way is to actually look at the traffic and look at the way your employees behave. But that's another problem. We have no idea how our employees behave. We have no idea how even our network is built. We have no even idea how many servers we have. So now analyzing the traffic and finding how this whole whole data is being sent in or out is incredibly difficult.
So we've got two things. One is behaviour. But to come back to your point, I think that if you look going forward, the problem you just described is really the problem that we are now making much worse with the Internet of Things. We are creating 5 million pieces of critical equipment which have 10 and 15-year lifespans with
$1 Wi-Fi card
that
in China.
is basically not built to the kind of security. So we've got a disaster that is waiting to happen, and I'm afraid, I think it is not until there is a sufficiently bad disaster that it will come with controls. It was like cars and everything else, that, you know, we can see the benefits of having these things. It's only when people start to die that the government says we're going to have to put some kind of regulation in place which makes them safe and durable for the future. But there is another question here, so let's...
Thank you, Mike. I just want to come back to your presentation, if I may, because a lot of this is very useful and interesting, but interesting on this last point. The certain question about vulnerability that WannaCry exploited is the tip of the iceberg, according to Shadowbroker, who are responsible for releasing it. So we've got a lot yet to come. But supply and demand governs the criminal fraternity just as much as it governs state-sponsored attacks, all the way through to how we spend money to protect ourselves where money is advocated from the board. Looking at some of the slides that you've presented, I have to agree with everyone who said this is a fantastic presentation, Michael. Thank you very much indeed for it. Where do you see the relentless march of the likes of NSA and GCHQ towards automation and the rapidity of having to deal with the noise, the chaff, around existing attacks, known vectors which are easily defensible, in inverted commas, because you know what you're looking for, which allows resources to be adequately and properly targeted on areas of vulnerability which are suspected of being vulnerable, for example, to the likes of a 0 day or whatever it may be. Because a lot of the noise, or forgive the repetition of the word noise, around automation is missing a very fundamental point in my view, and this is where I'd like your input, on actually helping boards, senior decision makers, people who own the checkbooks and who can sign them, on addressing the threat when they themselves don't necessarily understand some of these fundamentals that you've communicated so well in the last hour. So what are your thoughts on this march?
Well, I think there are a number of different dimensions to this. One is the latter point that you're bringing out is how do we talk to boards about it? And it was interesting to me to wonder what discussions had gone on inside British Airways about their plans to do with disaster recovery, because there was an example, and I'm not talking with any inside knowledge, I'm just looking at it superficially externally. Here was an organisation which clearly everything completely depended upon these IT systems. When they stopped, the whole shaboodle stopped. And so, you know, had anybody inside British Airways had that discussion which said, I want you to consider what would happen if everything went wrong, if the impossible happened, like it did in Manchester when the fire was in the bunker. Now, it may well be that the board would say, tough, you know, we'll just deal with it. But that is the kind of decision that they would have to make. And clearly, you can start to quantify the cost of that, because they've already sort of said that it's like 150 million. They reckon is the cost just in the compensation that they're going to have to pay. So, from the board's perspective, they are looking for what really could happen, what can I do about it, and how much will it cost, and what opportunities do I have? Now that's one side. Now, the other part of the question you asked was the one which was to do with automation. And to be quite honest with you, the company that I work for, we just gave a prize to IBM for Watson, cyber security and Watson. And the problem of dealing with the vast amount of information and the noise is something that IBM are applying now. Is it artificial intelligence? It's cognitive technology, where what you have, and I've seen some of this stuff in action, that basically they have Watson is reading blogs. It's reading all of the various websites that are doing this and building up a view of what's happening. And they have a number of examples that they've given where the actual physical cyber analysts in their, pretty extensive X-Force and so forth have dismissed something, but then Watson has come back and said, well, actually, you're not seeing the whole problem, because it's easy to become focused on one thing, and many of the attacks that occur are they start off with a diversionary attack, which gets your attention while something else is happening. And so there is a lot of mileage, I think, now that we have the computing power and the data feed capability for building things that are not intelligent, but are really better at picking out data from large amounts of data feed. And I'm using Watson as an example, but I mean, you've got Einstein and other examples coming out of this. And these have a potential for helping us. So I think you're going to tell us we've got to...
Well, yeah, because we've passed the time, and I think we can... You will be available to answer questions.
Yes,
here. We've got some sandwiches outside expecting you, so we can take the conversation over the sandwiches and wine. Thank you very much. Thank you.